Times of persecution. When we live among people who are threatened by our presence, we should expect various forms of persecution. Here now is Gene.
That's getting more and more relevant in our own culture, because more and more those of us who have a value system that reflects the Old Testament and the New Testament, and those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, more and more we are becoming a threat to people who do not like our values. And we're going to see that continue to increase, unfortunately, within our own culture. This happened to the children of Israel. So we read in verse 8 of chapter 1, a new king who had not known Joseph, didn't know Joseph, probably didn't care to know Joseph, didn't want to know about Joseph. He was threatened by Joseph. He was threatened by the history of what Joseph did. He was threatened by the fact that here was a man who was a Jew who had all this power. But he was also threatened by the children of Israel and their multiplication. So a new king who had not known Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Now, I'm not, I can't prove whether that's a statement of paranoia or a statement of reality. Regardless, he saw all of these people multiplying. And if he's using hyperbole, it still means that they're a threat. And he's threatened by it. Whether there were literally more Jews than there were Egyptians, I don't know. I'm sure you could calculate that and project that. But the fact of the matter is, it was a reality to him. And so he said, let us deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further. They'll just keep right on multiplying. And if war breaks out, they may join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. And so the Pharaoh that was in power at that time was very, very threatened. Now, this should not have been a surprise to those who knew the Old Testament, but keep in mind that they didn't have the Old Testament as we have the Old Testament. But see, God had said that this is going to happen. Now notice, if you follow through in the story here, Exodus 1:13-14, they worked the Israelites ruthlessly, made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. Now I mentioned that from the Old Testament record, if you go back to the Abrahamic covenant and God's communication with Abraham, Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, God said this was going to happen. He said, Then the Lord said to Abraham, Know this for certain, your offspring will be strangers in a land that does not belong to them. That is Egypt. And they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. And we're pretty far along in that 400-year period when Pharaoh took action against the children of Israel and did just some horrible, horrible things. Now, the principle basically relates to persecution. And we see the same thing happening when the church came into existence. The Jews, ironically, were the ones who were threatened. The Jews themselves. They were the object of persecution back in the time of Moses. But now they are the ones that are perpetrating. They are the ones that are persecuting Christians. And they were more of a threat to the Jews than they were to the Romans, because this was all happening in Jerusalem, which was the center of Jewish activity, the place where the temple existed. And you read the opening part of the book of Acts, we have on that day a severe persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. Who helped instigate this? It wasn't just the Sanhedrin, but it was Saul, who later became Paul. But he instigated this and created this incredible persecution against the Church of Jesus Christ. There was tremendous threat on the part of the Jews because of the multiplication of Christians. And notice, in those days, all except the apostles were scattered throughout the land of Judea and Samaria. There, I don't believe that's talking about all the people in Jerusalem who are believers. It's talking particularly about those 7 men that were chosen to wait tables, they were God-fearing Grecian Jews from other parts of the Roman world. Stephen was one of them, and he was martyred. He was killed for the cause of Christ. And that just introduced this incredible sense of persecution. And the other men were scattered. Philip went down to Samaria. Others went all the way to Antioch of Syria. And that's how the gospel was spread. And in 2 Timothy 3:12, in fact, all those who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Just returned from Greece and Turkey. And it's interesting to see in some of the excavations in the marble pillars and in certain sections where you see a cross that was carved in some of those marble pieces which related back to Christians that existed in the midst of those incredibly pagan cities, like Ephesus, for example. And Christians were persecuted because they were a threat, not just to the Jews in Jerusalem, but as they spread throughout the Roman world. And Rome, of course, was very expansive throughout that whole area, and they became a threat. And so they were persecuted. There were incredible times of persecution. Ironically, Saul, who became Paul, who was the one who was a persecutor, became a believer, and in his last letter, he's in prison in Rome when Nero was in power. And it's ironic because of what he wrote. All those who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. This is the last letter that Paul wrote before he was killed at the hands of Nero. The one who was the great persecutor became the one who was persecuted and gave his life for the cause of Christ because of Christ's work in his life, transforming him. In 1 Peter, and Peter probably wrote this about the same time, and Peter probably was, according to tradition, crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified right side up. He didn't feel worthy. And he wrote these words because persecution was rampant at that time among Christians. And he wrote, "Dear friends, when the fiery ordeal arises among you to test you, don't be surprised by it as if something unusual were happening to you. Instead, as you share in the sufferings of the Messiah, rejoice." Hard for us to identify, right? To rejoice in suffering, so that you may also rejoice with great joy at the revelation of his glory when he comes. If you are ridiculed for the name of Christ, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. And so these letters were written at a time of significant persecution among Christians. And Peter concluded there in verse 19, "So those who suffer according to God's will should in doing good entrust themselves to a faithful Creator." And there's a powerful principle that we looked at when we studied 1 Peter. When we suffer because of our Christian faith, we should draw strength from Christ's sufferings. That's the message of the New Testament. And so the reflection and response question is, if persecution towards Christians should intensify in our own culture today, how do you think it would affect the way we live? If we were persecuted like those who lived in the latter part of that first century there, in the 60s, I should say, and the 70s, where there was incredible persecution, how would it affect the way we live in our culture today? Well, I think one thing that would happen, it would separate people out who are Christians in name only from those who are true Christians. There would be a separation because those who are Christians in name only would not stand up for their faith in Jesus Christ. They would give up their faith, or their so-called faith, their name-only faith, and not follow Jesus Christ. That's one thing that would happen. That's something that has happened all the way through history. It even happened during the time of Jesus when Jesus was telling them some very significant statements about himself that they didn't want to hear because they wanted bread that would feed their bodies. And following the multiplication of the loaves, he said, unless you eat of me, drink my blood, you have no part in me. They literally wouldn't even stay around to understand what that literally meant, what Jesus was really saying. And they left. Many of them were disciples. They were disciples in name only. And that's when Jesus turned to the 12 and said, will you also go away? So you see those who are superficial, they're just following Jesus because it's convenient. They join the church because it's just good for your business to get to know other business people so you can multiply your business. You know, some people join a church just because they want to have contact with business people. You ever met some of those people? It makes good sense politically, doesn't it? If you're serving yourself. Those people are going to be separated out if persecution hits because they're not going to stand for Christ. The other thing that will happen is it'll cause many carnal Christians to live more godly lives. If you really know Christ, persecution is going to draw us closer to the Lord. It'll put us on our face before God. And thirdly, it will give dedicated Christians opportunities to grow even closer to God in order to be a witness for Jesus Christ. And you know, as I was looking at those three categories, I know I'm not in category number 1 because I know Christ. But boy, when I looked at number 2 and 3, I thought, where in the world on the continuum am I? You know, and I claim to be a dedicated Christian. But how dedicated am I? Really? And as I thought about that, you know, what are about the elements of carnality in my own life? And so, you know, it would be rather presumptuous to drop myself in category number 3. Totally. Because I'm with all of you. We live in a very comfortable society. And because we do, it's very easy to have elements of carnality, of fleshliness, is what it really means in our lives. And all of us would make significant changes if we were persecuted more for the cause of Jesus. And sometimes that's what it takes, I guess, to get our attention, to draw us close to Jesus Christ. I'm not asking for persecution. I don't want persecution. But I do know that ultimately we'll probably face it. Because if we don't, we're going to be the exception rather than the rule. So, the principle simply reads, when we live among people who are threatened by our presence, and if we're living for Jesus Christ in our culture today like we should live for Jesus Christ, we are going to threaten people who don't agree with us. And boy, we're seeing that happen. And we're going to see more of it in our culture today. And we should expect various forms of persecution. The important thing is, are we ready for that to happen? And when it happens, it will indeed refine us. It will refine us and draw us closer to Jesus. That is, if we know Jesus.